Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And thank you for coming. And thank you for stopping. As a representative of the Planning and the Black Community Division of the American Planning Association, I want to say happy anniversary to the National Organization of Minority Architects. You are our sister organization, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. Mustafa has already offered a little bit of background on the topic of environmental justice, so that makes my job a lot easier. The terms place-based and community-based are popular watchwords. And so my role today is really to explain that there are place-based approaches for advancing goals of environmental justice. The approach that I often talk to communities about is equitable development, and policy link, which is based in Oakland, California, is the main component for the approach. One of the points that I do need to make is the fact that Policy Link held their regional equity summit in the city of Detroit just last November. And there were roughly about 2,800 people from around the country who gathered in the city of Detroit for that summit. And so that's a very important milestone associated with just the traction that equitable development as an issue, as a public policy topic, has gained over the span of the past 10 to 12 years. I realize it's important to start out with a common definition so that everyone is on the same page. When I say equitable development, I'm referring to an approach for meeting the needs of underserved communities through policies and practices that reduce disparities while fostering places that are healthy and vibrant. Now, I realize it's a rather academic definition, and so I have a diagram that's really prepared just to illustrate the premise that the goal of urban redevelopment and meeting the needs of underserved communities are not mutually exclusive. We can address both. And when we do, the product or the outcome is equitable development. And as you can see by the diagram, there's an area of overlap. And this space is going to be the focus of my remarks. For the time I have available, I just want to offer a little bit of background on this topic because it is relevant to this issue of environmental justice and architecture. And then I want to take a little bit of time to talk about how, as a planner, in my own course of working on these issues, I've strived in order to seek middle ground in a sustainable world. And then I also want to explain a little bit about how equitable development was applied as a framework to a technical assistance project in Gary, Indiana that I had the fortune of working on. And it's really the opportunity, the event that served as a bridge for working with Sanford Garner and NOMA, and really has helped to advance some of the thinking that I've been doing around this particular issue. And then I want to offer my conclusions. But if I were to attempt to take 15 minutes worth of information and try to collapse it into one sentence, I think this quote that was offered yesterday in the session on cultural identity and architecture would sum up pretty much what I want to talk about. Catherine Prigmore, in the process of explaining during that session that our individual stories matter, took a moment just to share that really it's our experiences affect our process and it manifests itself in the aesthetics. And I'm sharing that because of the fact that we are the sum of our experiences. And as a planner, one important milestone in my own career was actually interning in the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA in Seattle, Washington in 1994. And that experience has shaped the way in which I view public policy, has shaped the way in which I view my own experience as a planner, and in terms of the work that I've done in the public sector. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but I do want to point out that that important milestone has really helped to guide the way that I look at issues, particularly as a planner, and given the fact that planners have a code of ethics where we're supposed to speak up for people who may not have a voice and encourage the alteration of policies that may not meet their needs. Now, normally when I'm invited to offer remarks on this topic, I begin by emphasizing an important point that's been made by the International City-County Management Association, and that is planning at its best takes into account the social implications of land use and economic development decisions. Now, what that means is planning, as a profession, is not institutionally separate from the social life. In practical terms, it means we are a nation of 309 million people. We have citizens from all walks of life. And if we don't think critically about how to meet the needs of vulnerable populations properly, then we may fall short in ensuring that everyone has a safe and healthy environment in which to live, work, and play. I don't want to belabor the point, but the social implications of land use and economic development have been a recurring theme in planning practice over the span of the past 45 years. Now, traditionally, the roadblocks to addressing social equity as we work to revitalize communities traditionally have been: one, framing how to implement it during the planning process; second, visualizing the product from that process; and then third, correcting the misperception that addressing these issues may slow down development. However, thanks to the tireless efforts of researchers and advocates, the creative thinking of planners and architects, as well as the compelling results of determined community builders, those barriers are coming down. We are learning that we can do well while doing good. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but one of the things that I do want to point out is the fact that these approaches are complementary to one another. Just as how concepts like smart growth, by a show of hands, how many are familiar with the concept of smart growth? Okay. Just as how smart growth is considered to be the sum of its parts, as noted by these principles, there is research that would suggest that communities practicing equitable development share the following commonalities. And it's really the synergy in terms of how these principles work together that result in places that are healthy, distinctive, and livable. Frequently, I lecture at universities around the country, and on those instances, I often share a personal anecdote with some of the students that I meet. And I talk to them about the fact that when I was in graduate school, I sometimes felt something was missing from the conversation. And after graduate school, I started working in the public sector on urban issues. And again, I felt something was missing from the conversation. I wasn't quite able to put it into words at the time, nor was I able to put my finger on it. But I realized that my training as a sociologist wasn't going to let me rest. And that's the abbreviated story of how these principles for equitable development were prepared. Over time, I learned that Alan Altshuler of Harvard University's Graduate School of Design was right when he said that no planner will be able to consider his education complete who has not dealt with the issues that Norman Crumholz faced. And that point that Alan Altshuler made was in a book on the topic of equity planning. Now today, we don't have to have an abstract conversation about equitable development. There are plenty of tangible examples that demonstrate the application of this approach. One great example is actually the 18th Combined Jazz District in Kansas City, Missouri. One of the things just to point out about this project is that at the turn of the 20th century, the 18th Combined neighborhood in Kansas City was the heart of the African American community. It was a place that was filled with entertainment venues, schools, businesses, churches, and recreational facilities. And of course, one of the most important things to note about this neighborhood is the fact that local artists like Count Basie and Charlie Bird Parker helped to refine their musical craft, particularly from defining jazz from a Kansas City perspective. But Kansas City, like so many urban areas, like Detroit, experienced 40 years of disinvestment and benign neglect that affected this neighborhood. Fortunately, because of a city council member by the name of Emanuel Cleaver, who's now a U.S. Congressman, he took the initiative to really help to create the 18th Combined Jazz District because he realized that this neighborhood had a place in making dividend. And so, in 1989, a city ordinance was passed in Kansas City, and eventually the city worked with the Boston-based architectural firm Stoll & Lee. And that firm actually worked on preparing the master plan for the 18th Combined Jazz District. In 1999, actually, there were two main assets in this redeveloped neighborhood. It was the American Jazz Museum as well as the Negro League Baseball Museum. But over the span of the past 10 to 12 years, there's been an increase in reinvestment within the area in terms of residential and commercial development, lofts, apartments, townhouses. And also several hundred residents within the city of Kansas City have now relocated to this part of the city. And so, in short, I just want to say that this neighborhood is now recognized as being successful and distinctive because it offers visitors and residents an authentic experience. It's one of the few cities within the nation where a sense of parity has been created in the manner by embracing cultural assets rather than allowing those assets to simply just be bulldozed over or allow them to just continue to atrophy to the degree whereby you feel that the best solution is just to build something else. Now, I could share other examples, but I don't want to take up too much time because we want to make sure we give other people an opportunity to present during today. But one of the key things that I do want to acknowledge is that examples like the 18th and Vine Jazz District, what they really convey is the fact that successful outcomes for equitable development are not the result of serendipity. Instead, they're the result of clearly set expectations, collaborative problem solving, and persistent leadership. The other thing that I just want to note is while I could share more examples, I think really what's more important to talk about, particularly during this span of time, is really how does all of this really connect to public policy? As I indicated, I do work in the public sector. And I want to respond to that question by simply using an anecdote. I'm going to borrow it from The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And I'm simply going to say, really, what does this have to do with whitewashing the fence? As I said earlier, I've worked on urban policy at the federal level, and it's been my experience that the handling of issues which fall along the social pillar of sustainability sometimes leaves a lot to be desired. And over the span of my career, I've had to learn really how to whitewash a fence. And what I mean by that is that I learned to make working on these issues really appear to be just as fun and fascinating as working on the prevailing approaches for sustainability. And so if you want to know what fun looks like, when you reach your tipping point, it looks like this. And so this is what happens when you move from your vocation to your avocation. And so when you reach that tipping point of having worked on something for so long and then you start to see results, you really just have a real sense of elation about it. And I just want to share that you would really be amazed just how quickly an institution will respond to an issue like equitable development once you've established a track record through lecturing and writing and recognizing communities around the country for doing the work, by making it a requirement of grants and cooperative agreements that you manage, by building relationships with allied professionals and conducting community technical assistance projects. Again, this is really about public policy, and the point that I just want to emphasize is that at the end of the day, public policy is just as much about priorities and values as it is about rules. And sometimes the best way to encourage an institution to be pliable is to simply change the way that we manage the projects which fall under our portfolio. Now, as I move to the latter part of my remarks, I just want to start by referencing the fact that history is prologue and it helps to inform our present. If I had more time today, one of the things that I would do is I would try to connect the dots between these three key leaders from the city of Chicago, and I think you recognize that guy right there. But instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to acknowledge the fact that trends really have an interesting way of repeating themselves over time. The city of Chicago is a city that has been at the convergence of issues like environmental justice and equity development. And I just want to point out that a similar convergence actually occurred in the city of Gary, Indiana, around 2007. At the time, Dr. Earl Jones of the Department of Minority Studies at Indiana University Northwest didn't want to acquiesce to business as usual in that city. And if you're familiar with Gary, Indiana, it has some character that's similar to Detroit in the sense that it's a distressed community. But one of the beautiful things about Gary, Indiana is the fact that it has its own lakefront. It has a lot of underutilized infrastructure. It has its own airport. And so Dr. Earl Jones, in his wisdom, didn't want to acquiesce to business as usual, and he eventually worked with the city of Gary, as well as the local empowerment zone, to submit an application to the Planning and the Black Community Division of APA. And because it was a competitive process, one of the things I want to share is the fact that the division could have gone anywhere in 2007. We received a request for assistance from the city of Orlando, Dallas, Atlanta, Newport News, Virginia, Washington, D.C. But we chose to go to Gary, Indiana for a couple of reasons. One, we wanted a return on our investment of time. Secondly, we felt we could make the biggest impact there. And the third reason why we went to Gary, Indiana is because Dr. Earl Jones did a wonderful job over a certain number of years of framing and articulating quite well the narrative of the African American community in Gary. And one of the things I want to point out as a planner is that sometimes it's really difficult to take a broad set of ideas and frame them into a cogent set of recommendations. And it was wonderful that in Gary, Indiana, they had already gone through the process of framing the narrative, framing the values, framing and clearly articulating and identifying what were the heritage assets they feel are important towards the placemaking dividend within that city. So we chose to go to Gary because of reasons that I stated previously. And so they asked us to work with residents within that community in order to frame a vision for a 1-mile span of their Broadway corridor. They wanted us to help residents within that community to be proactive and responsible rather than reactive and emotive. And so what I want to point out is the fact that we went to Gary, we focused on a very specific analysis zone. It was only a 1-mile span of the Broadway corridor. The reason why that area was significant is because it connected the city's downtown to Midtown. And Midtown is the heart of the African American community in Gary, Indiana. And there are a number of important assets to point out or treasures to point out about Midtown in Gary, Indiana. One of which is the fact that Gary's distinctive jazz and blues sound was prominent in the Midtown district. Another thing that's worth noting is the fact that VJ Records, which is a record label that had the U.S. distribution rights for the Beatles before those rights were sold to Capitol Records, is based in Midtown. Another thing that's worth noting is that there are many distinctive buildings that were designed by African American architects, and they're actually in the Midtown district. And so I'm sharing that simply to convey that Midtown is a place that captures the affinity of the local residents. And so over the span of 3 days, a team of planners, architects, community developers, policy analysts worked in Gary, Indiana, and focused on, one, encouraging development, protecting a sense of place, and positioning citizens so that they can actually guide and change the process in their own community. Now, one of the things that really contributed to the success of this project was the fact that the quality of the product wasn't set or determined by the client's level of investment. What I mean by that is the fact that the technical assistance team didn't produce a report that the local organizing committee could afford. Instead, we produced a report that the community deserved. And so we were determined to go to Gary to provide service, and in providing that service, we wanted to position the community to be able to make more informed decisions. And so we went to Gary with actually a $5,000 grant, but we leveraged well over $100,000 in technical support for the city of Gary because of the technical assistance team that we brought together. And one of the things that I still have a difficulty shaking in the process of working on a project of this nature is the fact that as we were coming to the point of actually wrapping up the project, Michael Jackson died. And so we submitted the final report to the local organizing committee in Gary, Indiana, just 4 days after the passing of Michael Jackson, who many of you know is one of the favorite sons of the city of Gary, Indiana. And so, as I wrap up, I want to point out the fact that clear outcomes are the most important part of any technical assistance project. I'll only mention 2. One is the fact that the vision is public policy. Actually, in 2010, the Gary City Council voted to amend their comprehensive plan in order to include this vision in its entirety. And the second thing that I want to point out is simply the fact that this project was recognized by the American Planning Association for contributions to the planning profession. And the reason why I want to state that is because this is really what happens when organizations like the National Organization of Minority Architects and the Planning and Black Community Division work together. And so, while the commendation is nice, that's not the reason why we went there. I think what's important for me is the fact that I would like to believe we received the commendation because of the fact that we were effective in showing that you can have a public dialogue on social equity and community planning if you have the will and the desire to do it. And that's what we strive to do. NOMA, PBCD, community developers, that's what we strive to do in Gary, Indiana, when we conducted this technical assistance project. So I want to conclude simply with the following point, and that is, innovation requires changing the conditions of the test. I see some Trekkies out there, so obviously you got that point when I just said it. I'll reframe it another way. I like to quote George Bernard Shaw sometimes, and he's remembered for having said, there are those who look at things the way they are and say, why? I dream of things that never were and say, why not? And so I came here today because I wanted to get across that the approaches for encouraging sustainable communities are not restrictive. They're actually expansive, and they include concepts like equitable development. The second point I just want to make is the fact that I really believe that the premise of innovation requires acknowledging the fact that healthy things grow, including paradigms. And so if we're flexible enough to allow the paradigm of sustainability to account for issues like social equity or equitable development, then we can encourage a sense of fairness in planning that will help to foster community merit. And so I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate. I appreciate the patience, and I'm looking forward to continuing this discussion.